Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started. The fall of 2013 was supposed to be the start of an unforgettable college journey. I had just moved into my freshman dorm at the University of Alabama, eager and a bit nervous, carrying all the anxieties and dreams you would expect. The plan was simple: study hard, make friends, and experience the freedom of living away from home. Originally, I was supposed to have a roommate named Caleb, but just before school began, Caleb withdrew his enrollment, leaving me with a room all to myself. For a college freshman, this was like winning the lottery. The first weekend rolled around, and everyone on my floor was getting to know their roommates. Dorm life was bustling with energy, with people running down the hallways, knocking on doors, and introducing themselves. I, on the other hand, was alone in my room, feeling a bit left out but also grateful for the peace and quiet. Sunday night, as I was getting ready for bed, there was a knock on the door. I thought it might be one of my new dorm neighbors, but when I opened it, a guy I had never seen before was standing there. He had this small, almost shy smile, and introduced himself as Jonah. "I go by Joe," he said in a quiet voice with a subtle accent I couldn't quite place. He had a dark hoodie on, and a backpack slung over his shoulder. No other luggage, nothing that indicated he was planning to settle in for long. "Are you sure you're in the right room?" I asked, feeling slightly confused. I hadn't been told about anyone moving in. Joe nodded, looking around the room as though sizing it up. "Yeah, I was told this was the right place. I didn't get here until today, so it's been a mess trying to figure out my dorm assignment." He seemed harmless enough. A bit reserved, maybe, but nothing out of the ordinary. I stepped aside and let him in, figuring he'd sort out his things and get settled. The only odd thing was that he didn't have any actual luggage, aside from the backpack. He placed it on his bed, then stretched out a plain sheet over the mattress, using his backpack as a makeshift pillow. It was strange. Most people would have at least some bedding, right? But I brushed it off, thinking he'd probably have more stuff arriving in the morning. "You know, you can borrow one of my pillows if you want," I offered. He gave me a brief nod, thanked me in a near whisper, and took the pillow. As the night wore on, I tried to get some sleep, but something felt off. There was this unsettling silence between us, and every now and then I'd hear a faint rustling coming from his side of the room. I chalked it up to nerves. I mean, it was the first night with a new roommate, after all. Sometime after midnight, I must have drifted off. But around 3 a.m., I jolted awake, sensing that something was wrong. I lay there in the dark, disoriented, until my eyes adjusted and I realized. Joe was standing beside my bed, just watching me. I could barely breathe, paralyzed with this primal fear I'd never felt before. My voice came out in a shaky whisper. "Joe? What are you doing?" He blinked, looking caught off guard, and muttered something about needing to use the bathroom. Without another word, he shuffled to the door and stepped into the hallway. I was so rattled I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, just lay there staring at the ceiling, questioning every decision that had led me to that moment. The next morning, after he left for what I assumed were his classes, I took a closer look around the room. I noticed my closet was slightly ajar, and a few things seemed out of place. Nothing major, just small things: a drawer that was half open, my phone charger missing from where I'd left it. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was being paranoid. That day in class, I couldn't concentrate. The strange behavior, the way Joe had stood over my bed, it all gnawed at me. I decided to email the dorm's housing office, asking if they had another room available, or if there was any chance I could switch. I didn't mention Joe specifically, just that I wasn't feeling comfortable in my current setup. When I got back to my room that afternoon, I found the door was locked from the inside. I knocked, feeling a strange mix of irritation and dread. Joe eventually opened it, looking at me with this empty, unreadable expression. Behind him, I saw a large duffel bag on his bed that I hadn't seen before. "You got more stuff?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even as my pulse quickened. He just shrugged and said he'd been reorganizing. The whole situation felt surreal. I retreated to my side of the room, avoiding his gaze as I checked my email. My inbox showed a new message from the housing office. When I opened it, my blood ran cold. The email read, "We have no record of a new roommate being assigned to your room. No one named Jonah has been added to our system." I froze, reading it over and over, hoping I'd misinterpreted it. But the words stayed the same, and the reality of the situation sank in like a weight in my stomach. I was sharing a room with a complete stranger, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Every instinct I had told me to get out, so I casually began packing up a few essentials, stuffing my laptop, wallet, and phone charger into my backpack. Joe was lying on his bed, watching me with that same hollow stare. I gave him a forced smile, muttered something about needing to get some air, and left the room as fast as I could without running. Once I was outside, I broke into a sprint and didn't stop until I was halfway across campus. I called campus security, telling them everything in a shaky voice. They assured me they'd check it out and asked me to meet them back at my dorm. When we returned, the room was empty. Joe, and all of his belongings, had vanished. The duffel bag, his backpack, even the sheet he'd laid out on the bed, were all gone. It was as though he'd never been there in the first place, leaving nothing behind but the echo of his unsettling presence. In the following days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of Joe's eyes following me even though he was nowhere to be seen. The dorm staff later told me they suspected he was a vagrant, someone who'd slipped into the building unnoticed. They found out he'd likely been squatting in empty dorms, moving from room to room to avoid detection. 2 days after he disappeared, my real roommate finally arrived, completely unaware of the nightmare I'd just gone through. I tried to explain it to him, but words failed. How could I describe that hollow gaze, that chilling feeling of waking up to find someone watching me in the dead of night? Back in my sophomore year, I lived in a cramped dorm room with a girl named Lauren. We got along well, which was more than I could say for most of my previous roommates. She was a bit messier than I was, okay, a lot messier, but it never bothered me too much. We had a decent rhythm. I'd sleep on the top bunk since I was a light sleeper, and Lauren, who often got up in the middle of the night, took the bottom. That arrangement worked for us. One night, I was up late studying for a big presentation I had to give the next morning. I was nervous, so I'd asked Lauren to sit on her bed and pretend to be my audience while I practiced my speech. She was nice enough to humor me, even though I could tell she was exhausted. She even offered to lend me one of her blouses, a white, soft-looking button-up that I thought would be perfect for the presentation. After I'd finished practicing, she yawned, said goodnight, and climbed into her bunk. I stayed up for another hour, skimming over my notes, replaying the presentation in my head, trying to make sure I had everything just right. Around midnight, I finally shut off my laptop, climbed up the ladder, and curled up under my blanket. The room was quiet and dark, just the faint hum of the mini-fridge and the occasional creak from the hallway outside. Around 5 a.m., I woke up to a soft noise. It was still dark, but just enough early light filtered through our window for me to make out vague shapes around the room. I was groggy, still caught between dreams and wakefulness. The sound I'd heard was soft and shuffling, like someone moving around quietly. I figured it was Lauren. She often woke up in the middle of the night and moved around a bit before settling back down. "Lauren?" I whispered down to her, still half asleep. There was a pause, then I heard a soft from somewhere near the foot of the bunk. "You okay?" I asked. I saw her silhouette in the dim light near the wardrobe, which was on the far side of the room. It looked like she was rifling through her clothes, though I couldn't imagine why she'd be doing that at this hour. I lay there watching her, still trying to shake off the fog of sleep. "Hey, are you looking for that blouse you lent me?" I asked, still a little dazed. Lauren didn't say anything, but she made this small motion, like a nod. I could see her outline bent over, rummaging around the bottom of the wardrobe. Then, she straightened up, and for a moment I swear I saw her glance my way. Her figure was dark against the faint light coming through the window. She lifted one arm in this slow, strange motion, like a wave, but more deliberate. I lay there frozen. Something felt off. Lauren wasn't usually this quiet, even at odd hours, and the way she waved was just unsettling. But I brushed it off, telling myself I was half asleep and probably imagining things. She moved toward the door, and with one last look in my direction, she slipped out into the hallway, quietly closing the door behind her. I rolled over and grabbed my phone to check the time, 5:03 a.m. It was way too early for her to be going out, but I figured maybe she was just using the bathroom. I lay back down, thinking I'd drift off again, but just as I was settling in, I heard a noise that made my heart nearly stop. It was soft, but unmistakable, the sound of Lauren's breathing, coming from right below me. I froze, my mind racing to catch up with what I'd just heard and seen. Slowly, I peeked over the edge of the bunk and looked down. Sure enough, there was Lauren, curled up under her blanket, sound asleep. A chill ran through me. I wasn't imagining things. I couldn't have been. I'd seen her standing by the wardrobe. I'd heard her answer me. And yet there she was, right beneath me, breathing steadily, as if she'd been there all night. The wardrobe door was still open, exactly as I'd seen it when she had been rifling through it. But Lauren hadn't left her bed. That much was clear. I lay back down, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake her. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Maybe I was sleepwalking and imagining things. But it didn't feel like a dream. It felt terrifyingly, unmistakably real. Minutes passed, and I couldn't shake the dread that had settled over me. I finally got up, climbed down from the bunk as quietly as I could, and tiptoed out into the hallway. It was empty, silent, and still dark. I looked up and down the corridor, hoping to see anyone. But there was nothing. Just the dim, flickering light from the emergency exit sign. I stood there, staring down the hall, my skin prickling with fear, until finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I went back inside, closed the door, and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. After a moment, I went over and shook Lauren's shoulder. She groaned and rolled over, mumbling something incoherent. "Lauren, wake up!" I whispered, my voice trembling. I was shaking her harder now, practically panicking. She sat up, blinking at me in confusion. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. I told her everything, about seeing her by the wardrobe, about her leaving the room, about how she'd been asleep the whole time. She listened, her face going pale as I recounted each detail. Without saying a word, she threw off her blanket, climbed down from the bunk, and went straight to the wardrobe. She rifled through her things, checking pockets, drawers, anything that might have been disturbed. But nothing was missing. Everything was in its place, exactly as it had been the night before. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, but that open wardrobe door kept nagging at me. I hadn't touched it, and neither had Lauren. Yet it was open, just like it had been when I'd seen her, or whatever that was. We both decided to report it to campus security, just to be safe. They took down our statement, though I could tell they thought we were just a couple of overtired girls with too many exams on our minds. They checked the security footage from that night, hoping it might give us some kind of explanation. But there was nothing. No one had entered or left our building. The hallways had been empty all night. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night. I've replayed it over and over in my head, trying to rationalize it, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But no matter how much I try, I can't shake the memory of that figure standing by the wardrobe, glancing up at me, and waving in that strange, deliberate way. The story I'm about to tell happened during my junior year in college. Back then, I was sharing a suite in one of the older dorm buildings with 3 other guys. We each had our own rooms, but we shared a common area and a tiny kitchen that always smelled vaguely of stale coffee and last week's leftovers. My suite mates were Kevin, Troy, and initially, someone named Doug. Doug moved out around October, which left us with an empty room. We figured we'd have the extra space for the semester, but before long, the school assigned a new guy to our suite, a guy named Daryl. Daryl was ordinary looking, if that's a way to describe someone. Tall, really tall, probably around 6 feet 4 inches, with short, blonde hair and sparse facial hair. His face was kind of forgettable, in a way, almost generic. When he first moved in, he seemed like the quiet type, maybe a bit shy. For the first few days, he hardly left his room. We'd catch glimpses of him grabbing food from the fridge or walking by to use the shared bathroom, but he wasn't the kind of guy who'd initiate a conversation. One evening, I was in the common area flipping through some notes, when Daryl wandered in. He sat down across from me, hands fidgeting with the sleeve of his sweater, and told me, almost out of the blue, that he had a condition called parasomnia. I had no clue what that meant, but he explained that it's a sleep disorder that makes him do strange things at night. He said he might talk, shout, or even wander around while asleep. Daryl wanted to let us know so we wouldn't be disturbed if we heard anything weird at night. At first, I shrugged it off. I mean, it's college. You hear all sorts of odd noises at night, right? But I'd be lying if I said his warning didn't make me a little uneasy. That night, I sent a message to our group chat, which included Doug, even though he moved out. Guess what? New guy says he sleepwalks and talks in his sleep. If we hear weird noises at 3 a.m., it's just Daryl living his best horror movie life. Kevin and Troy thought it was hilarious, and Doug chimed in, joking that we'd end up as characters in a creepy dorm room legend. The weirdness started a couple of nights later. I'd been up late studying for an upcoming exam and had just turned off the lights when I heard it, 3 soft knocks on my door. Half awake, I mumbled, "Yeah?" But there was no response. I opened the door a crack, but the hallway was empty. In the morning, I asked Kevin and Troy if either of them had decided to prank me. Both swore it wasn't them, and after some laughter, we dismissed it. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that maybe Daryl's parasomnia was more intense than I'd thought. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, the knocks were louder, more insistent, and I could hear faint footsteps shuffling down the hall afterward. I decided not to open the door, but I was pretty sure it was Daryl. The next day, I brought it up casually in our group chat, and Doug, the eternal instigator, egged me on, making jokes about the sleepwalker coming for you. Then things got a little more intense. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps again, followed by a soft scratching at my door. I sat up in bed, barely breathing, trying to figure out if I was dreaming. But the scratching continued, slow and deliberate. Just when I was gathering the courage to confront whoever, or whatever, was on the other side, it stopped. The next day, I told Kevin and Troy. They laughed it off, but I could tell they were getting weirded out too. That week, the knocking incident, as we started calling it, became a bit of a running joke in our suite. Doug would check in from his off-campus apartment every night, half mocking, half genuinely concerned. The tension between us and Daryl grew subtly, a weird unspoken tension. We weren't trying to be rude, but we started treating him a bit differently. And Daryl? He seemed off somehow. I'd catch him glancing my way in the common room, his eyes a bit too focused, his face carrying an unreadable expression. One night, things escalated. It was about 2 in the morning, and I was asleep, dead to the world after a long day of studying, when I suddenly woke up. My heart raced before I even opened my eyes, some sixth sense screaming that something was wrong. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone whispering, low and persistent, in the corner of my room. I jolted upright, and there he was, Daryl, standing in the far corner by my dresser, his face turned toward the wall. His shoulders were hunched, his hands hanging limply at his sides. He was whispering something under his breath, words I couldn't make out. I was frozen, heart hammering, my mind racing through every horror movie scenario I'd ever seen. "Daryl?" I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. He just kept whispering, his voice a little louder now. I could catch snippets of what he was saying. "Open the door, let me in." My skin crawled, and I finally found my voice, louder this time. "Daryl!" He turned slowly, his eyes half closed, his expression blank. For a split second, he looked straight at me and smiled, a strange, almost mechanical smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Open the door," he repeated, then let out a small chuckle, as if something about the phrase amused him. My heart was in my throat as he turned and left my room, walking down the hall, mumbling that same phrase under his breath. Just as I was catching my breath, I heard him start banging on Troy's door, louder and louder, shouting, "Open the door! Open the door!" I ran out of my room, just in time to see him pounding his fists against Troy's door, his face contorted, his eyes wide and wild. Kevin and I rushed over, grabbing him by the shoulders and shaking him, trying to snap him out of whatever trance he was in. After what felt like an eternity, he stopped, his body going limp, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at us, a blank, confused expression on his face, and muttered, "Sorry, guys," before shuffling back to his room and closing the door behind him. The next morning, we all agreed this had gone too far. Kevin suggested we call campus security, but we were hesitant. We didn't want to get Daryl in trouble. Still, we decided to at least report it to the resident advisor, hoping he'd be able to talk to Daryl or suggest some kind of solution. That night, though, something happened that made us all question whether Daryl's condition was really just parasomnia, or something far darker. That next night, I made sure to lock my door, triple-checking it before crawling into bed. I even wedged a chair under the handle, just in case. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that Daryl was just dealing with a strange, severe sleepwalking condition. But the image of him standing in the corner of my room, whispering and smiling, replayed in my mind on a loop. I barely slept, lying awake and listening to every creak and groan in the walls, every footstep down the hall. Around 3 a.m., just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it again. Soft, deliberate knocks on my door. 3 in a row. I held my breath, staring at the sliver of light underneath the door. Shadows shifted as someone tall, based on the way the light bent, stood just on the other side. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it. I didn't move, barely dared to breathe. The knocking stopped, but then came a voice, low and drawn out, muffled through the door. "Let me in, let me in." It was Daryl's voice, but it sounded wrong, off somehow. There was something cold, almost mechanical in his tone, like he was just repeating the words without understanding them. Then, just as suddenly, the voice faded. The shadow slipped away from my door. I stayed up the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep. At dawn, I heard my suite mates stirring in the common area. When I went out, Kevin looked as pale as I felt, his eyes ringed with dark circles. He knocked on my door too. He whispered. Just stood there, knocking, and saying let me in. I thought it was a nightmare at first. Troy nodded. Same. I didn't open it. I stayed still until he went away. We shared a long, tense silence, each of us thinking the same thing but not daring to say it out loud. We were terrified of Daryl, or rather, of whatever Daryl became in the middle of the night. This wasn't just parasomnia. It was something else entirely. When Daryl finally emerged from his room that morning, he looked tired, dark circles under his eyes. He acted as if nothing had happened, offering us a small, sleepy smile as he shuffled to the kitchen. Morning, guys, he mumbled, pouring himself a cup of coffee as though he hadn't been stalking around, knocking on our doors and whispering strange things just a few hours earlier. Kevin pulled me aside after Daryl left for class, his voice low and urgent. We need to get him out of here, he whispered. This isn't normal sleepwalking. This is something else. Something dangerous. We decided to call campus security that evening and ask them to come talk to Daryl, or at least evaluate the situation. But that night, before we could make the call, things took an even darker turn. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps in the hall. I tensed, holding my breath, hoping he'd just walk by. But the footsteps stopped right outside my door. The doorknob rattled softly, as if someone were testing it. Then I heard the scratching, the slow, deliberate scrape of fingernails dragging down the wooden door. This time, the voice that came through wasn't muffled. It was clear and urgent, almost frantic. "Please let me in. Please. I need to come in." The voice trembled with a desperate intensity, but I stayed frozen, gripping my sheets so hard my knuckles went white. And then the voice shifted, the pleading replaced by something colder, harsher. "Open the door," Daryl's voice commanded, but it didn't sound like him anymore. It was as if someone, or something, was speaking through him. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of bed and flung open my door, ready to confront him, maybe to snap him out of it. But what I saw made me freeze in place. Daryl was standing in the hallway, his face turned down, but his eyes wide open, staring directly at me. His expression was blank, almost lifeless, and his skin was pale, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Slowly, he tilted his head to the side, a cold, empty smile spreading across his face. "Thank you," he whispered, so softly I almost didn't hear it. I stumbled back, slamming my door and locking it. I could hear him chuckling softly, a dry, hollow sound that echoed in the silence of the hall. Then he started moving again, his footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing down the hall as he muttered something under his breath. In a panic, I messaged Kevin and Troy in our group chat. "He's at it again," I typed, my fingers shaking. "He's out in the hallway, whispering and laughing. I don't know what to do." Kevin replied almost immediately. "Stay in your room. Don't open the door. I'm calling campus security." I stayed huddled in my room, listening as Daryl's footsteps moved from door to door, knocking and whispering at each one. Finally, I heard the voices of campus security officers coming up the stairs, calling his name. I opened my door a crack, just in time to see them approach Daryl, who was now standing at the far end of the hall, his back to them, completely still. "Sir?" one of the officers called. "Are you all right?" Daryl didn't respond. He just kept staring at the wall, his hands hanging at his sides. The officers cautiously approached him, reaching out to tap his shoulder. Daryl jerked around suddenly, his eyes wide and furious, his face contorted in a twisted expression I'll never forget. He let out a strangled scream and lunged at one of the officers, who barely managed to dodge. They finally managed to subdue him, holding him down as he struggled, shouting nonsense words and laughing hysterically. When they escorted him out, he looked over his shoulder, catching my eye with that same blank, eerie smile. The next morning, Daryl was gone. Campus security told us they'd taken him to a nearby hospital for evaluation, and we assumed he'd be back eventually, once things were sorted out. But days turned into weeks, and he never returned. His belongings were cleared out by campus staff, and his room was left empty. The weirdest part? No one seemed to know where he'd gone. Even the resident advisor couldn't give us an answer. It was as if he'd just vanished. I moved out of that suite the following semester, along with Kevin and Troy. None of us talked much about what had happened, but there was an unspoken understanding between us that whatever Daryl had been dealing with, it wasn't just sleepwalking. There was something else there, something darker, something that lingered in those hallways, even after he was gone.